I think we can begin now. Good evening and welcome everyone to the third online lecture conducted by the ECC. This evening we have two prominent scholars, one from Old Testament and one from New Testament. From the Old Testament we have Dr. Balu Savarikanu, who will speak to us on the spirituality of God's silence in lamentation. And the New Testament scholar, Dr. Priscilla Papia Durairaj, on the topic spirituality of women with reference to Mary and Elizabeth from the Gospel of Luke. So the sessions will be moderated by Father Kulas and the second session by Dr. Bennett Aaron Lawrence. And the presentations shall be, each presentation shall be for 40 minutes, 30 minutes for presentations and 10 minutes for question and answer. So without wasting much time, I hand over the time to Father Kulas. Over to you, Father.
Thank you, Minu. Good evening to you all. It's a pleasure to join again in the Zoom online seminar organized by ECC Bangalore. I'm glad to moderate today's first paper, The Spirituality of God's Silence in Lamentations. We have an eminent scholar to read the paper, Dr. Balu Savarikanu. Dr. Balu is a professor of Old Testament studies at Hindustan Bible Institute and College in Chennai. He completed his MTH from SciArts, Bangalore, and PhD in Old Testament from Asian Graduate School of Theology, Philippines. Biblical Hebrew and Old Testament exegesis are research interests of Dr. Balu. Interestingly, apart from teaching, Dr. Balu helps poor children of remote villages in Tamil Nadu to receive free education. Dr. Balu, in the name of all participants, I welcome you wholeheartedly to this seminar and request you to present your paper. Over to you, Dr. Balu.
Okay. Good evening to you all.
Good evening.
Thank you to ECC, Dr. Kulas, for moderating this session. And my personal thanks to Dr. Johnson Thomas Kutty for inviting me to speak and making this opportunity possible. So a school teacher asked a student, "Why is your exam paper blank?" And the student said, "That is because, teacher, sometimes silence is the best answer." So the student escaped. It's just a joke. But speaking about God's silence is an important topic. Just yesterday, I was talking to one auntie, and she was narrating about her elder son's life. And she said, "I have been praying for long, but God is silent." So this question about God's silence is not just the question and contemplation in ancient times, but it is still a relevant topic in our times today. And it is an oxymoron that I speak words to talk about silence. But the topic is still timely. Please allow me to show my PowerPoint, and then you can hear me at the background. Yes. So let me begin with what R.S. Sugedraja says about biblical criticism. And he says in his book, Asian Biblical Hermeneutics and Post-Colonialism, that the classical, historical, and literary approaches to the Bible are colonial in nature In a sense, they direct us a certain way of reading the biblical texts. And so Sugandharaja questions the very notion of biblical criticism because it is more of a colonial compulsion and thereby reducing our pleasure of reading the Bible. So he urges Asian biblical interpreters not to overtly dependent upon others' interpretation, but to be on their own. Instead of seeking binary oppositions, we need to live with complexities. So here we are not to choose east or west, rather we should refuse to choose only one perspective. And this statement is important because many readings of the Bible tend to focus on the positive dimensions of biblical texts. So we call the spiritual path fire positiva and fire negativa. And most of the reflections are fire positiva, focusing on the good nature of God, God's promise, grace, and mostly centering on the speaking God. So as a result, there are many positive theologies focusing on God's promise, power, and deliverance. One of the paths in spiritual journey is fire negativa, which presents God as a silent God. And it is also about experiencing the presence of God through desolation, through suffering. So fire negativa is often ignored in biblical theology. But the silence of God is an important element in biblical theology. Our spiritual maturity has to do with our understanding of the silence of God. It may be unorthodox to think God as a silent God, but it is biblical. Now, the central question that I would like to address today is, why is God silent in all of Lamentations? And before that, please allow me to establish the fact that the Lamentations is nothing but the house of sorrow, housing so many human voices. And from there, I would like to ask the reasons, possible reasons, why God is silent in Lamentations. And what is the spiritual message that it carries for us in today's times? Now, the book of Lamentations houses human voices. The book of Lamentations, I do not need to give an introduction to this scholarly group, that it is one of the small books in the Bible. And it has 5 acrostic poems, although the 5th poem is not acrostic per se, but it has 22 verses, which is the number of Hebrew alphabets. Now, the reality is that the book of Lamentations is not anyone's favorite book to read. And if you play Song of Songs and Lamentations side by side, there is a marked contrast. So the book of Lamentations bewails the loss of Zion's beauty, Judah's beauty, glory, the loss of kingdom, the loss of lives, people. So the book of Lamentations is all about human voices. Now, a voice is a literary persona that the poet creates to talk about a certain perspective. There are multiple voices in Lamentations. Now, scholars have found out different voices, many different voices in the entire book of Lamentations. But that is not enough. In my PhD dissertation, I argued that there are 4 different voices in each poem of Lamentations. Now, these poems, these voices in each poem are very different to each other, and they dialogue. Now, all these different voices, the divergent voices, reflect the community's struggle to cope with their suffering. Judah suffered so heavily at the hands of the Babylonians in 587 BCE, and it became a vassal to Babylon. Many people were deported to Babylonian kingdom, and the poor were left in Judah. So the voices in Lamentations vividly describe, portray the loss incurred. And there are different reactions to this problem. All these voices embody the community's varied reactions to their national catastrophe. So I don't, for the sake of time and also the limitation of page, I would like to focus on Lamentations 1. And if you see in the slide, I have mentioned 4 different voices in Lamentations 1. And the voice of despair, convention, protest, petition, the names are just a heuristic labels. They are not fixed titles, because at least I mentioned these words, despair, convention, protest, and petition, just to show the different perspectives in response to the suffering. The first 4 verses, and also verse 7, talk about voice of despair. The focus is only on Judah. The voice of despair mourns over the reversal of Judah's fortunes. Judah was like this, now Judah is reduced to dust, she has become a widow, she cries all night. And then we have voice of convention in verses 5 to 9, and also verses 10 and 11, where the focus is on the enemies, the punishment through enemies. And it readily accuses Judah as sinful, thereby deserving punishment. So this voice is really different from voice of despair that simply mourns over the reversal of Judah's fortunes. Because voice of convention accused Judah, saying, you have sinned. Judah has utterly sinned. Look at verse 8. It is very emphatic. Judah has heavily sinned, utterly sinned. A voice of protest rather accuses God. Now the focus is on what God has done. It accuses God that God had overdone his punishment, because the voice of protest cries, is there any suffering like mine? God is the one who pulled me down and overpowered me. Most of the imageries are rape imageries, very raw images. And the last one, voice of petition, pleads God to intervene and deliver. So voice of petition acknowledges God's righteousness just to motivate God to intervene and deliver the people. Not only there are 4 different voices in Lamentation 1, they dialogue. As I mentioned, the voice of convention quickly responds to voice of despair, saying the suffering is not an accident. Rather, suffering happened because of Judah's sin. And voice of protest responds to voice of convention, saying that Judah is not all that deserves, but even God has overdone the punishment. And the voice of petition obviously clings to God. So these dialogue, these 4 voices dialogue each other. And I would like to see these 4 voices and the dialogue within in the light of what Mikhail Bakhtin, the Russian literary scholar, talks about dialogism and polyphony. In the theory of polyphony, each voice in a literature is independent, legitimate, and unique. And there is no hero voicing. So seen through Bakhtin's polyphony, I would like to state that the voices in Lamentations, each voice in Lamentations 1, and of course the voices in other poems in Lamentations, are unique and legitimate. There is no hero voicing. That the meaning of the book should be seen in the light of multiple voices and their perspectives towards suffering. So what we have been seeing so far is that the book of Lamentations is a house for human voices. It is filled with human voices, the voices that speak to God, against God, and speak to one another. And there is a dialogue with it. So this shows that the faith community is not just a solo community. There is room for different responses, different reactions to suffering. And there should not be any overpowering voice, but rather each response, each voice is important. Each perspective is important simply because suffering is complex and it affects people in different measure. And quickly, let me talk about the significance of acrostics because it really helps about knowing different voices accommodated. Some scholars see acrostics connoting the totality of the subjects like A to Z. And some people say that acrostics aid memory. It's easy to memorize. And some say that acrostics give a genre, a form that motivates readers to read full. But for me, acrostics accommodates different expressions, that different voices find place in this genre, as far as Lamentations is concerned. Now, let us, I did talk about Bakhtin's polyphony, but I can explain in discussion if you ask for more. But the theory of polyphony and dialogism says that in a polyphonic writing, each voice is important, as I mentioned. Now, here is the central question that we have come to. Why is God silent in Lamentations? Now, is God truly silent in the book of Lamentations? Because some argue that God's voice is overheard from far away in Lamentations. For example, in chapter 3, verse 15, there is a statement that you have said, do not fear. So that a quoted word, do not fear, is God's word. So some scholars say God still speaks, even though it's a quoted speech. But I would like to argue that Lamentations 3:57b cannot be reckoned as God's voice, because there the voice of petition simply recalls God's deliverance in the past and is hopeful that God will deliver his suffering people. And the use of the perfect tense in Hebrew suggests that God's assurance in the past is simply remembered to motivate God to intervene in the present suffering. The point is, God does not speak as a character, as a voice, anywhere in Lamentation. And some people say, well, God speaks in the entirety of the scripture, that the silence of God in Lamentation should be dealt in the light of the entire Bible. And I agree. And it is also true that the Hebrew Bible is polemical in arguing Israel's God is speaking God, while the pagan gods cannot speak or nor hear anything. All that good. But it is striking that in the midst of human voices in Lamentations, the much expected God's voice is missing altogether. At least in the book of Job, God spoke in the whirlwind, but there is no whirlwind speech in the book of Lamentations. So we ask the question, why God is silent in Lamentations? God, there could be many possibilities. Perhaps God is silent because of Judah's sin or offense. And this is important because nowhere in Lamentations there is a denial of sin. Obviously, the voice of convention is very vocal about Judah's sin. Even other voices, for example, even the voice of protest in chapter 5, verses 2 to 10, bewails that the people suffer more for the sins of their ancestors. So they do not claim they suffer innocently, but they cry that their suffering is so much that it looks like they are bearing even the sins of the forefathers. So taken together, the book of Lamentations is not cries of innocent suffering, no, because all voices agree to some extent that God punished Judah for her sins. But most of the voices cry out that the punishment is so severe and unbearable. So God is silent, perhaps Judah is guilty. The second idea that some propose, that God is silent in Lamentations because God is stunned at Judah's immense suffering. He's baffled at the consequences of his judgment. For example, in chapter 1, verse 10, we read that even though God forbade the invading nations to enter into the temple But the nations destroyed the temple. They entered the temple, looted all the precious things. So maybe God himself is baffled at Judah's suffering, that his calculation went wrong and he keeps himself silent. Possible. But what I would like to say, and I agree with many evangelical scholars who have talked about God's silence in recent times, that God's silence in Lamentations is a respectful silence. That is, by keeping himself silent, God allows human voices to speak, and thereby he honors those expressions. Earlier, we argued that Lamentations has no dominant voice, and each voice is unique and legitimate. Imagine if God had spoken, then his voice would have dominated other voices, like God's whirlwind speeches in the book of Job. Kathleen O'Connor says, any words from God would trump all speech. Instead, God's silence gives reverence to voices of anger and resistance, hope and despair. Thus, God honors human voices in Lamentations, just as he honored the confessions and complaints of Jeremiah, and the protests and laments of Job, and the petitions and the cries of his own son, Jesus Christ. According to Michael Amaladas, the most striking example of God's silence is when Jesus cried on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? There, God's silence silences his own voice, because God's silence leads Jesus to death. Although God resurrected Jesus, but at that time when Jesus cried, God was silent. And so Amalada says, silence between God and Jesus hides an exchange of love that will fructify as a new life. The silence, therefore, is full of promise and hope, not of despair. I would like to add here that silence is also part of communication. God's silence in Lamentations communicates by not hindering or stopping any human expressions. God is silent so that human voices can be spoken up and can be heard. Any human expression is possible before God at the verge of suffering. There is no superior expression to God during suffering. Federico G. Villanueva says it well. In Lamentations, God has decided not to speak. For to speak would be a torture. There is no speech, no words, no encouragement that will suffice to answer the loss of a child swept away by flood waters. Silence is the only thing that is needed. In Lamentations, we encounter a God who shares our pain simply by allowing his people to express to him all their questions, hurts, doubts, and pain. There is one area that Lamentation scholars have not addressed while talking about God's silence, is the mystical union of both God's and human voices. In India, mysticism is not uncommon philosophy. In Christian mysticism, the union of the human soul with God is so intimate that it is often compared with the marriage of a man and a woman. In Christian mysticism, the I ceases to exist and the self is abandoned. In a mystical union, there is a total surrender and submission. In this light, I wonder that human voices might become gods. Therefore, the silence of God in Lamentations could also be as God echoing human voices in suffering. So the book of Lamentations is full of voices, human voices, and God's voice is missing. God is silent because God honors human voices. And what it has to teach for us today. And first, let me say, I have not developed this thought, but Because God is silent, the church has to speak up. Because God, by keeping himself silent, he permits polyphonic expressions. God even echoes human voices. God in his silence also participates in human voices. God nods for every voice and expression of suffering. There is no superior or inferior voicing before God. And he is very much part of our groaning because God values each of our responses at the verge of suffering. It can be protest, it can be penitence, it can be petition. God is very much part of our voices. The Holy Spirit intercedes through our groaning. In Romans, we read in Romans 8:26. God understands our limitation and shortcomings. He sees who we are. For suffering Asians, the vulnerable God is more comforting than the victorious God, because most of the words, while we talk about God, sovereign, warrior, victorious, these words sound so colonial to my ears, if I'm not wrong. But for the suffering masses in Asia, the portrayal of God's vulnerability and silence are much more comforting. And by keeping himself silent, God validates human voices. Because God validates human voices, the church should speak up for the voiceless. Also, the validation of human voices by God's silence is a wake-up call for modern churches that glorify their differences. God's silence leads to the spiritual understanding that God is beyond all that we say about God. God is beyond doctrines, theological formulation, institutional and denominational churches. Many times, our approach to the Bible seems to be a monologic effort, thereby undermining diversity. Each church claims its legitimacy based on their own perspective of the Bible. Different denominations claim their legitimacy over others. However, God finds each expression to him as legitimate. Every voice matters to God. So in conclusion of my short paper sharing is that Fire Negativa should be part of biblical theology. Our spirituality includes our experience of God in the times of desolation. A faith community is made up of different so a faith community is made up of different people with different capacities. There is room to vent out their responses to suffering. There is no better reaction to God. Every voice matters to him. God's silence empowers us to speak to him, against him, but to cling to him. God's silence also enables us to speak to each other, for each other. It is in the dynamic dialogue of faith conversation, the meaning of life and spirituality is understood. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Balu. It was a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
And personally, now I understand the spirituality of God's silence in the Lamentations. And you began with the positive reading of the Bible, God as a speaking God, and versus the negative reading of the Bible, God as a silent God. And a wonderful development of why God is silent in the Lamentations. And you took one lamentation to highlight there are different voices in a poem and their dialogue. but God's voice is not heard. And this, you have given multiple reasons why God is silent in Lamentations, especially in first lamentation. I'm not going to repeat. And from your presentation, I understand the spirituality of Lamentations. And the spirituality of lamentation in one word is silence. Silence communicates, silence accommodates, silence respects, and ultimately silence, God's silence, is the expression of his love. And to you challenges to take up God's voice today, and we become God's voice today. And God's silence empowers us to speak on his behalf. Thank you very much. Now I invite, and first of all, I congratulate Dr. Balu, and now I invite the participants to come out with your queries and clarifications. As usual, let us take up 3 clarifications.
Anyone who has questions, you may please raise your hand. Okay. Ma'am, please go ahead.
First and foremost, I'd like to thank the presenter for this excellent paper, the excellent reflection on the Book of Lamentation. It was really very nice and very refreshing, especially at a time like this when we are all at, in the lockdown mode. And thank you so much for this breath of fresh air. I don't have a question as such, but a comment to make, and especially I would like to. I really liked the point where you said towards the end that God is silent because God honors human voices, and that was really excellent. And then, of course, you also said God's silence merges into human voices and the spirituality of God's silence. I mean, that was really wonderful, very nice, and thank you very much for that. And just thought it may be a little funny, but when I was seeing that where you said that God is silent because God honors human voices, sometimes in these Zoom meetings, we unmute ourselves. And I think that unmuting is very important for, better levels of bandwidth and so on and so forth. And I think it's also like that. I mean, very simple understanding that God, and the other thing that I was also thinking that as God is silent, he also silences people at times for perhaps greater revelation and clarity. And this is because, my topic, which I'm going to speak after some time, is from Luke. And I remember the story of Zechariah, where Zechariah was silent. He was made to not to speak for some time. He was muted literally. And that there was a reason behind it, apart from Zechariah's disbelief or whatever. But Zechariah needed to comprehend more about who God is and God's promises and so on. And one last comment is you had mentioned that Jesus' cry on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me, is a kind of a silence which has merged with the silence of God. I just want to comment on that because for me, the cry of Jesus from the cross, I feel that it is the breaking of the silence because that cry is a cry of desperation. And I can so much identify it with the cry of, people when they are actually crying, especially in times like this, when people are actually crying out, my God, where are you? Why are you silent? And so for me, Jesus' cry on the cross is the breaking of silence. So thank you very much for this wonderful reflection. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Next one.
So, yeah, Father Matthew. Yeah, please, Father.
Yes. Dr. Balu, thank you so much for presenting a very exciting topic, that is silence of God. And in history, we often come across the silence of God. And I'm not a biblical scholar, but I'm very interested to follow the presentation and also the logic you are presenting. There is also during the annihilation or the Holocaust of the German, or the Jewish people during the Nazi regime. There is a beautiful book written by Elie Wiesel, The Night, which has been given the Nobel Prize. So he was in that, accusing God, that, why he was so silent during such a very tragic event was going on. And we should also remember that he is the one who rescued them from the suppression of the Egyptian Pharaoh and the others. So even now we can see that, thousands of people are dying because of corona virus. We couldn't do anything. We are all confined. And a moment of God's silence we are also experiencing. And to me, what you were presenting is that, defending God because of his silence. I am angry because, when such a tragedy is happening, God is not at all intervening. But we see that at times he is intervening. When he is intervening, maybe the way you presented that, God is giving us a chance to give our voices. So that would be, to me, it is a lame excuse of the lack of God's presence. And what would you answer to this angry question of the human condition?
Yeah, shall we take one more?
Is there anyone?
Can I? Yeah, Father Praveen here.
Okay, yeah,
Okay.
please.
Somebody else then.
Praveen G. Souza? Okay.
Proceed.
Okay. So I would like to thank the speaker for wonderful presentation. Just two comments. One is thank you for bringing out this mystical way of looking at this whole atmosphere of lamentation. Something new for me, and thank you for that. I just would like to ask you whether the cry of the people and the silence of God, in that sense, should we take this negatively? In that sense, is it a cry of hopelessness? In that sense, or they cry today we interpret as mystical? Is it all right? I'm just a little bit of doubtful about this way of interpreting today, but I do like the way of mysticism that is involved in this. Thank you.
Okay, I think Dr. Balu can respond.
Yes. Thank you to Priscilla for the encouragement. And you did make a statement that God, by his silence, many times he silences people. That is true. But in the book of Job, we see God's speech even empowering Job. For example, in Job chapter 38 to 41, God speaks about his creation. And that whirlwind speech is not at all directly related to Job's suffering. Then we wonder what God is doing there in his speech. That is because by showing his creation, his work, creative work, God empowers Job to speak up. And so by the time we come to chapter 42, unlike the traditional interpretation that says Job repented, my interpretation of Job 42:6 is that Job recanted, he rejected, saying, whatever you say, God, they go too wonderful for me. So I take comfort in dust and ashes. And I believe God restituted him because of his protest wisdom. So even through silence, God empowers people more than silencing him, more than silencing people. All right. So that's one thing. I don't know whether that meets your question. Thank you, Father Matthew. Your question is really thought-provoking. And can we defend God? Can we defend God's silence in the book of Lamentations? And you said, my response to that God honors speeches, voices, seems to be a lame excuse for God's absence. First of all, to me, the book of Lamentation, I talk from the book of Lamentations point of view. In the book of Lamentations, there is both theodic and anti-theodic assertions. So we have chapter 3, verses 24, 22, 23, 24, where it says the steadfast love of God never ceases. So there's a strong theodic thing. But then I noticed throughout the book of Lamentation, there is a strong, bitter lament, questioning God, questioning God's justice, raw expressions. But the point is, God is silent. That is because he let those raw expressions spoken out. All right. So I don't see it's a lame excuse, but I tried my level best to speak from the book of Lamentations. Now, can we apply that to our modern suffering? That's another thing we all need to wrestle with. But I only focused on the book of Lamentations and God's missing voice in that context. But I really appreciate your book. We all struggle with this theodic question, don't we? And thank you, Praveen, for asking this question. Yes, can people's cry in Lamentations be seen negatively? For example, there are raw protests against God. Is it right? Martin Luther, he said, Job heavily sinned for God because of his lament. And I disagree with Luther, because God never judged Job because of his raw protest. Rather, God valued him because he said, no one has spoken like my servant Job did. And that is not because Job fully just surrendered, but he held on his raw protest against God. So I don't think the cries of people in Lamentations is a negative thing. To me, it sounds like that God honors all those speeches. But the churches seem to privilege one sort of voice. For example, the churches seem to privilege the voice of convention, which defends God. But Lamentation privileges the polyphonic voices that protest to God and confess before God and make petitions. Thank you.
Father Kula, can we go one more round of questions, like Reverend Helen and John Pratipati would like to ask questions?
Sure.
Can we give them time?
Sure. Helen?
Can you hear me? Hello, Dr. Balu. Thank you so much for your presentation. As a biblical student, I'm a Hebrew Bible student as well. So I'm excited to listen about Lamentations, and the way you have presented also is a unique presentation for sure. And I appreciate you for that. However, in line with what Father Matthew has already said, I'm also wondering the attempt to privilege only the speech, and as you would understand, mostly the Hebrew Bible has the speeches of men recorded, and women's speech is mostly not recorded. And so when women's voices are silent all the time, and we assume that only speeches, through speeches, God is representing God's self in one way, or God is kind of allowing some polyphonic voices in another way. So I'm just wondering, I have a challenge or difficulty in understanding or trying to privilege only the speech. That is one first question. And the second, I mean, connected thing is that God's silence makes sense only when there is a voice, right? In what you are presenting is God's silence makes sense only when there is a voice. So when there is no voice, God's silence doesn't make sense. And in Hebrew Bible also we notice that many of the rape narratives we notice that women are silent. Say for example, Dina, you know, and so how do we understand silence in those spaces? And also, when it comes to the vulnerable communities itself, we often affirm and believe that subaltern cannot speak, right? If subaltern cannot speak, but in liminal spaces they do speak, but when in points when they are not able to speak, how do we make sense of God's silence?
Okay, we take up John Babu.
Can I respond?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just a small clarification, sir. Yeah. At the outset, I would like to thank for the new thought given to me. That is God being silent to the prayers of the victims or vulnerable or whatever it is. So it's very exciting on my part to learn this point. But I also have, coming from the homiletics or hermeneutical point of view, how far is it legitimate to say that God is silent? Is it, or are we speaking in terms of apologetics, trying to defend the book of Job in God's point of view? Or can you please help me out? Please help me out in understanding from the homiletic point of view. Is it apologetical view? That's my point.
Dr. Babu.
On.
And one question is sent in the chat box. Sir Balu,
Yes.
are you able to access that? Yeah, if you can respond even to that.
Okay, thank you. First of all, thank you, Helen, for the wonderful question. What happens when there is no voicing, right? And you said women many times, they lose voice. Subalterns, they don't speak much. So what happens there? And very interestingly, I found in the research of Lamentations that most of the voices coincide with women voices. In fact, if you see Elizabeth Lee, she argues that the speakers in Lamentations are women. In fact, she goes on arguing, it is the woman writer who penned the book of Lamentations. And in my application side, I appropriated the book of Lamentations to the Tamil Opari lament tradition, where women come at the front and pour out their voicing, their emotions. So, in fact, Opari is a subaltern women voicing, because unlike other communities, they come at the front of the funeral place. They put their arms around, they cry aloud, they wail, and they voice out, right? So, to me, the voices in Lamentations are not just male voice. It is the voice. It's a literary persona. The poet gives a perspective. It is not, of course, you are right, because many commentators in Lamentations, they see one male, and one female speakers. And I don't agree with that. This persona is a genderless. And it's very striking that most of the expressions are female-bound expressions. And so why privileging speech? Why not silence? Well, as the students of the Bible, you and I, we try to understand from what is there, that is the written words of God. And from there, we understand God and our life, right? So I try to study what is written in the book of Lamentations, what has been voiced out, and why God is silent and what it means to us. And John, thank you. From homiletical side, that's a good question. Recently, I read an article that, in fact, preaching the book of Lamentations is really difficult one. All right, even biblical laments. It's very irony that laments don't find place in the pulpit. It's simply because it's difficult. In one way, you can say laments don't market well in this prosperity gospel-driven churches. But homiletically, it's really difficult. That's why some people focus on the middle of the chapter 3, talking about the positive things. But I think in reality, Lamentations end with a negative thing. And so homiletically, probably you can see the message of Lamentations in the light of the whole writings, or in the light of second Isaiah, because scholars have found out that there is a good parallel between second Isaiah, even Ezekiel, and Lamentations. So yes, the canonical understanding of the Bible will help for a homiletical preaching. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Balu. Thank you. At least 5 people got a chance to raise their questions, and the answer was given appropriately. And God's silence honors human voices. God's silence empowers human voices to speak on his behalf. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Balu, for enlightening us once again, and your very insightful presentations on the spirituality of God's silence in lamentation. And also, we thank Father Kula for moderating the session. And now we shall proceed to the next session. Shall we invite Dr. Bennett Lawrence? And I request him to invite and also introduce the next speaker. Over to you, Dr. Bennett.
Sorry, thank you very much. It was a very nice paper, and thanks to Dr. Balu, who is my immediate neighbor. I don't get to see him, he's just across my street. But anyway, it was good to see him in Zoom and listen to him. So we can go to the next presentation as it is already time. So let me invite Reverend Priscilla Papia Durairaj, is an ordained minister of the Church of North India, Kolkata Diocese. She is also Professor of New Testament at Bishop's College, Kolkata. Her paper today is entitled Spirituality of Women, with reference to Mary and Elizabeth in Luke chapter 1, 26 to 45. Without further ado, please, Reverend Priscilla, it's your time.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bennett, and my personal thanks to the organizers of the ECC seminar, and also personal thanks to Dr. Thomas John Putty. And I'd like to say at the very outset that this was supposed to happen on May 7th at the ECC campus in Bangalore. And of course, we were all getting ready, but somehow because of all that happened in between, the lockdown and stuff like that, so everything went for a toss, and somehow I thought that this was completely cancelled, and I was not able to prepare a proper paper as such. So when Dr. Johnson, Thomas Putty, requested me to do this today, I agreed, no doubt, but I said that it will not be a proper academic paper, so as to say. So what I've done is not a paper as Dr. Balu has done, but it's just a simple, some collected thoughts and reflections of mine from the title that is there before you. And of course, in the days to come, I will try and put it together in a proper manner. And of course, many of the things will be fragmented, so I need your valuable suggestions and comments. Now, this is a paper, I call it a paper. So it's a general overview of the spirituality in what spirituality is all about, and women's spirituality, which I have done in a very sketchy manner. And the next thing is that I've tried to understand the spirituality of Mary and Elizabeth from Luke chapter 1, verses 26 to 45, and understanding women's spirituality in the Indian context, basically, on the religious observances, which also has been done very briefly. And finally, I've tried to expand this whole idea of what women's spirituality is all about in the light of Mary and Elizabeth, and where I have tried to say that this kind of a spirituality transcends boundaries, and it is more to do with women's experiences. So I've just got some slides before you, so which I would like to share. Yeah. I hope it's clear to everybody. Yeah. So here, of course, the title Spirituality of Women with reference to Mary and Elizabeth, Luke chapter 1, verses 26 to 45, and its relevance in the Indian context. And though it says an exegetical study and or feminist reading, I mean, I have to do that better. So defining spirituality, so I've just tried to define it in very simple terms, that it is, as I have understood, it's connectivity with something higher than ourselves. It can be said to be a kind of synergy between our personae and our activities, our thinking, and so on. Spirituality of women is to understand women's connectivity with the higher self, resulting in the synergy that is at work in her person, in her thinking, in her mental, emotional, spiritual, and physical makeup as a result of her personal connectivity with the highest or the divine. Most importantly, such a connectivity calls for righteousness, justice, peace, and harmony. And it is in the translation of justice, righteousness, peace, and harmony that spirituality is manifested and appropriated. One of the things that I've also mentioned, or one needs to remind themselves, is that at this juncture, it is of utmost importance to recognize the fact that women's spirituality is also about the mundane. It's not about everything that is ethereal, but it is also about the mundane, the everyday struggles, women's anger, her frustration, her resistance to many injustices that happen in her day-to-day surroundings and survival. Then, of course, just I want to discuss about the spirituality of Mary and Elizabeth. Mary, as you know, was a young virgin from the town of Nazareth, engaged to be married to Joseph. Mary's spirituality, as we see in the Bible, is quite reasonable enough to understand that she had a divine connectivity for which she is visited by the angel Gabriel to convey to her the strange divine message of her being chosen as the mother of God. She was considered the favored one who has been found to be in synergy with God and herself, one on whom the divine mercy and grace are poured out beyond measure, one who was willing to participate in the divine mission. And thus we see that as Mary confronts the angel, trying to figure out the magnanimity of the words of the Lord, she finds peace with God and herself, by which she is able to say yes to the plan of God. Now, this affirmation to acceptance of the divine will is what Mary's spirituality is all about. Of course, this is in a nutshell, as you can all understand, emanating from her personal experience of the Most High God. And I have also put it in this way that perhaps this can be understood as a theophany in her very being, in her inner being, which is further elaborated beautifully in the words of the Magnificat, or the Song of Mary, as we call it, found in Luke chapter 1, verses 46 to 56. The Magnificat, I just like to discuss very briefly, as the name suggests, is to do with enlarging or enlargement. The Song of Mary is the celebration of divine righteousness and justice. Now, this celebration is possible on account of the new realization of the magnanimity of God. The song itself affirms that the soul and spirit have been enlarged because of the theophany that has taken place within Mary. This theophany is not just a realization, but the reality of actually carrying God in her womb. We come to Elizabeth in Luke chapter 1, verses 5 and 6 tell us that Elizabeth was a descendant of Aaron. Both she and her husband Zechariah were righteous and blameless before God. And we are also informed that Elizabeth was barren and getting on in years. In Luke 1:25, it is said that she conceived and remained in seclusion for 5 months. And then she commented, "This is what the Lord has done for me when he looked favorably on me and took away the disgrace I have endured among my people." Now, all these express Elizabeth's spirituality. It was once again a joyful and grateful celebration of divine goodness to someone who was marginalized, stigmatized because of her former status of being barren. At this juncture, something noteworthy needs to be looked into, and that is to understand that Mary's spirituality, Mary's and Elizabeth's spirituality is can be seen in the backdrop of their marginal status and disgrace and shame. So I call marginal status because both were women. One was barren and hence she was marginalized, and the other was a virgin. And so a virgin to be pregnant was again something very shameful, and hence disgrace and shame. Now, this kind of backdrop does not pin them to the corner, but rather it becomes the location for celebration of righteousness, justice, peace, and harmony. Luke skillfully portrays this by the forward and active move of Mary in Luke 1:39, which says, "In those days, Mary set out and went with haste to a Judean town in the hill country." Now, this kind of an action to me is like a relay, and is caught on by another movement, the baby in the womb of Elizabeth, who leaped within her. And somehow I have tried to coin a new term, a new expression. And for me, this phenomenon is a kind of a biological, dialogical spirituality. Now, this is again, very briefly, again in a nutshell, to understand Mary's and Elizabeth's spirituality. Then quickly looking at the spirituality in the Indian context, women's spirituality in India is very evident in the practice of various religious observances, very much within the sphere of the home. In Bengal, women observe many such practices, most of which are attached to vows or vratas, or vrats as they are called. One of the popular of such observances is the lunar observance, or what is called as Ekadashi. Now, Ekadashi is a Sanskrit word which means the 11th day, or it refers to the 11th day of a fortnight belonging to a lunar month. There are 2 fortnights in a lunar month, the bright and the dark. So Ekadashi occurs twice in a month, in the bright fortnight and the dark fortnight. The special feature of Ekadashi, as most people know it, is a fast, abstinence from diet. The significance of this particular observance is not merely constituted of a fast physically, though it is also an essential element. In fact, it is a very important element of this particular observance. It has other deeper aspects, which is of special significance to one's personality, basically for prosperity, well-being, and so on. And I would just like to mention at this point that one of our helpers, I mean, my mother is an invalid person, and she has a caretaker who is there with her, and she is the one who practices this very regularly. And right now, during this lockdown period, she has been staying here, and she does this every 15 days with a lot of passion, and it is so much in her. And I also make sure that she is able to observe all these things properly, and it really makes me think that no matter whatever faith traditions you come from, but somewhere this connectivity to the highest is always there. But again within this connectivity, there is the element of struggle, the element of despair, and so on and so forth. Then I have just summed up the whole idea in this way, that spirituality becomes the occasion for celebration of God's mighty deeds and the point of proclamation of such deeds. And in Mary and Elizabeth, spirituality becomes a deep personal experience. In them, it is not so much about gentleness, compassion, or being merciful, which are often thought as, women's spirituality in inverted commas. It is to do with the declaration of the establishment of the reign of God. Spirituality in Mary and Elizabeth is more of participation in the eternal plan of divine salvation. It is a spirituality which I have tried to understand, which transcends human boundaries from the ordinary to the extraordinary. Elizabeth go beyond ritualism, beyond tradition, beyond patriarchy, beyond biology. It is also about the mundane, the everyday struggles, her anger, her own frustrations. In fact, again, coming back to Luke 1, 24, 25 rather, because when she says that this is what the Lord has done for me, when he looked favorably on me and took away the disgrace I have endured among my people. So during those days of endurance, it was a terrible experience for her. There was anger, there was frustration, and perhaps even she would question God, why are you silent? And her resistance, and not only her here, I don't mean only Elizabeth, but women in general, women's resistance to many injustices that happen in her day-to-day surroundings and survival, which we can see even in this time of the pandemic. And I'd just like to draw one illustration, and it's just here, very close to where we stay. So we have a market over there, and there are a lot of poor people outside the market, and there is one particular family. I mean, there are many families. Naturally, I would not know about everyone, but I'm just talking about this one particular lady who has 2 small children, and she's there standing by the market gate, and people come and help her out, whoever wants to, because most of them sort of ignore her, I mean, which is supposed to be normal. And this lady's husband is a drunkard, but nevertheless, she's someone who, even in this time of struggle, in her own poverty, makes sure that her children are fed, even if she is not fed properly, if she does not even get to eat properly, but she makes sure even her drunkard husband gets some kind of food. And so this is her personal struggle. So women's spirituality is something which has proven to be potential, not just for women, but for all. And with this, I'd just like to come to the end of my presentation.
Thank you very much, Reverend Priscilla, and it was an interesting paper.
Yeah.
And you presented by defining spirituality, and you went ahead and talked about the spirituality of Mary, identified the ways that spirituality is exemplified in the text. and also you talked about the spirituality of Elizabeth, and you coined the term called biological dialogical spirituality. It's an interesting term. And you went ahead and talked about the spirituality of Indian women and used it as a parallel to read the spirituality of these two women in chapter 1 of Luke. Thank you very much for the insightful ideas that you have presented. The floor is now open for the questions and comments. Please go ahead.
Anyone who has questions, you may just unmute and speak it out. All else, you just raise your hand. We can unmute.
Hello.
Okay, please, Johnson.
Good evening to all.
Good evening.
Thank you for the wonderful presentation. I just have two questions on the paper presented. Number one, on the definition of spirituality. So the definition says is connecting with higher one. My question is connecting with higher one only the spirituality is not holistic? That's number one. Number two, the spirituality of Elizabeth and Mary in Luke. I see Mary is more holistic than just merely connecting with a higher one. So if you can clarify these two, that'll be good. Thank you so much for the wonderful presentation.
Thank you, Johnson.
Thank you, sir.
Anyone else?
Yeah, while others are preparing to rate their question, I also would like to, make a comment and also raise a question. Ma'am, you speak about the spirituality of Mary and Elizabeth and as participation in the divine plan. So what can be our approach to this? How one can experience such spirituality in the present day?
Okay. Yeah, I can add one more comment or views. I want to request the view of Reverend Priscilla on this one. It is about Elizabeth being presented as an example for obedience or example for Mary. And how do you see that? And we see that angel is going there to Mary, and then he's saying that you will give birth to a child, but he is also pointing out that Elizabeth also has a child in her old age, and she has been pointed as an example, and which could give a little more faith perhaps to Mary for her obedience. So how do you see that? So you can go ahead and answer, ma'am.
Okay.
We already have 3 questions. Yes.
All right. Thank you very much for the questions. And so the first question is, the definition of spirituality. Is it only connectivity with the highest? Is it not holistic? Definitely. Without being holistic, I mean, when we talk about connectivity with the highest, definitely it is holistic, because without this understanding of holistic, we cannot even fathom what spirituality is all about. Because that's what I had also mentioned, that when we are talking about connectivity to the highest, on one hand, we are also talking about the mundane experiences, the day-to-day struggles, the despair, the cries, and that is also women's spirituality. I can even tell you from a woman's experience that sometimes women are thought to be, talking too much, or even, being too caring, sometimes perhaps nagging. But I think this is all part of that spirituality, part of that holistic spirituality. Then coming to the second question, spirituality of Mary and Elizabeth, and how can one experience it? And I think it's not that they are somewhere, far away from us, but we can experience those kind of things even in our day-to-day lives. I mean, we are talking about Mary and Elizabeth as the models or as examples, but many women are experiences and have experienced similar things. And I think, how do we do it? I mean, of course, I cannot give you a prescription, so as to say, because this all emanates or emerges from personal experiences. But one thing is to be open. You know, one thing that we see in both Mary and Elizabeth, both of them were open. I mean, you know, perhaps it was a very frightful thing to hear that in, you know, my old age, I'm going to conceive, or in my virginity, I'm going to conceive. These were terrible realities. But both of them were able to open themselves up to face the challenge. And I think that is the secret to, you know, go about in this kind of a holistic spirituality. And Dr. Bennett, your question that Elizabeth has been pointed out as an example to Mary, and how does that help? And I think that is, I feel, a very, from a human point of view, that Mary being a very, very young girl, she needed this kind of an assurance, because on one hand, as she was debating within herself that how things were going to happen, and though she was believing all that the angel had said, but on this, at the same time, she needed some kind of an assurance. She needed some kind of support. And I think, you know, this was just to give her that full assurance that don't think that you are alone in this entire thing, but even your cousin is part of it, part of this challenge. So this is what I would say. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Any other questions?
Okay, Father, please.
Thank you, Reverend Priscilla, for this wonderful presentation. You have gone deeper into the interiority of the women and the dimensions of her personality in presenting the spirituality of Mary and Elizabeth. But I have a complaint that when Mary was asking all kinds of doubts, God was very sympathetic, or, you know, even Gabriel was very sympathetic. And but when Zachariah, Elizabeth's husband, was doubting, I am in old age, then, you know, God made him mute. And then also we have Joseph, and God did not, only in a dream, and while to Mary he has directly appeared and spoken in detail and everything. So why God is preferring the women here, and then very concerned about them, rather than you know, the men were also in the same situation, but he is giving them a very harsh treatment.
Can I answer that, or?
Yeah, we can add one more, ma'am.
Yes, okay, sure.
I mean, someone has asked this question on, can you please explain the definition of spirituality a little more? So you can go ahead and answer these two.
Now, see, the definition of spirituality, now that was just in few words, and I think I need to do much more research, but what I understand about spirituality is definitely a connectivity. You know, connectivity, I begin with the highest, with the divine, and of course connectivity to my surroundings. You know, like spirituality cannot happen in a vacuum. I cannot practice spirituality just like that, you know, in the air. So there has to be some connectivity to even the gross reality, and that is what spirituality is all about. So my thinking, my emotions, my passions, my expressions are all part of that connectivity. So this is again what I can tell you very briefly. And coming to Dr. Matthew's question, I know that even I was thinking about that, whether God was partial, but I think even in Luke's gospel, we always see there's a preference to women, but not to say that, you know, God only preferred women, but I think there is a very strong message that God is always on the side of the marginalized, on the side of those who are not able to speak much. And so, you know, when we were just talking about the silence of God earlier, So this is something, you know, where God intervenes in the lives of those who are silent, or those who have been made to be silent. You know, so in that way, you know, Mary was a teenager. We all know that she was not just a young girl in her 20s or 30s, but she was a teenager not of today's time, but teenager of those days. And it was something very, very difficult for her to come to terms with whatever the angel had conveyed to her. And I think that for her, there was no question of doubt. When she said that, how is it possible? Because I'm a virgin. So that was quite a legitimate question. But of course, we can't say that Zachariah's question was illegitimate, because there also he was an old man and his wife was old, and how can even such a thing happen? But you know, a miracle can definitely happen in old age. You know, we know of a lot of people who have conceived, you know, even those who have got married 10 years, 15 years. So those things can happen. But for a virgin to be, you know, to conceive is something that doesn't happen, and it goes outside the norm. So that way I would say. But definitely, you know, it is. I don't have the license to give the answer to all these questions, because you know, this is something much more deeper. It goes beyond. So that is what I would say. Thank you so much for this question, and it would make me think. And perhaps as I make a proper, you know, paper, your questions and comments will help me to think more deeply.
Thank you very much. Okay, any other questions? I think on a lighter note, Father Matthew, we may have to start writing.
Andrew?
Go ahead. Sorry.
Thank you, Dr. Priscilla, for sharing this talk. I'm just wondering, for this, for the Lucan community, are these passages negotiating the trauma of the community? You know, this can go to the question to Dr. Balu also. I wanted to ask him also, but you know, we are dealing with this. The one is the trauma of being wounded, and we require healing, and that's what is happening in Lamentations. And here too, these women are going through this trauma, but the community is going through a trauma of being tagged as an illegitimate community because of Jesus, his illegitimacy birth. And Luke is trying to negotiate it in these passages. So I just wanted to put that forward to all of us. You know, there is this this trauma going on, and we require this healing to happen in our communities, and that's why Luke is bringing forth this passage of blessedness to the womb. You know, so how do you understand this passage with this lens?
May I?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, thank you very much for that question, and I think that is quite an eye-opener, and I shall definitely put that in my paper as I prepare it properly. So the trauma of the community, Lucan community, and I would say not only the Lucan community, but the community of all times. And this was a message to that, the kind of trauma that people were experiencing, the trauma of being, you know, whether you call it illegitimate, the trauma of being stigmatized, marginalized, again, because of Jesus Christ. And the healing definitely needs to happen. And just a, you know, a flash thought that comes to me is this new birth, you know, whether the birth of John the Baptist or the birth of Jesus Christ. And both these births are going to bring about new life, bring about healing. And I think in that way it fits very well, you know. So when I'm trying to connect spirituality, and especially in the light of Mary and Elizabeth, and since you're talking about healing, so just just I would like to say that this healing will definitely happen because of the birth of a child, a birth of a child that will herald a new age altogether.
Dr. Balu, do you want to respond also? Okay. Do we have any other question? We have 4 more minutes.
Father Kulat? Yeah, please.
Just a clarification. While Reverend Priscilla was deliberating, she said the spirituality of Elizabeth crosses boundaries, culture, tradition, biology. And in what context was that particular statement? Because for me, both Mary and Elizabeth are in the Jewish culture and situation. They're meeting also, both the same culture is meeting, same tradition is meeting. If that is the case, how the statement Elizabeth crosses boundaries or traditions and cultures?
Well, I'm sorry, but I think I've not been able to get you clearly. If you can kindly repeat that question, please.
I was just raising a clarification. Can you hear me?
Yeah, but it's sort of breaking in between. But yeah, please carry on.
My internet connection is very poor. I was just wondering, in what context can we make such a spirituality of Elizabeth that her approach crosses boundaries, culture, and tradition? Because for me, she remains in the Jewish culture, even in the meeting of both Mary and Elizabeth, both are from the same tradition and culture.
Okay, I would just say definitely I'll give more thought to it. But of course, they definitely remained within their boundaries of culture, ethnicity. But what they have experienced and what their very actions have actually crossed boundaries. So the way they have accepted the whole challenge, the way they have responded to the whole thing has definitely crossed boundaries. And especially again, coming back to the Magnificat. So the entire content of the Magnificat is something very revolutionary. It's not just a song of praise, not just a song of celebration, but it is a song that is very revolutionary, that calls for a total reversal of systems. And so in that way, boundaries are broken because such a song should be put in the lips of such women, or whether it's Mary or Elizabeth, that's again a question, whether the Magnificat was sung by Mary or Elizabeth. But the thing is that in that way, they have crossed boundaries. And I'm sure, perhaps this is thinking a little beyond the way both these mothers have brought up John the Baptist and Jesus, and all that they have experienced from them have also been instrumental in the way that both of them, the way they sort of ministered to the people. So the mother's contribution definitely was something great, though we are not told much. Definitely Jesus was the Son of God, and he had this authority and everything, and so was John, who was definitely inspired by the Spirit of God, and he would go and speak about all kinds of things to people and call them to repentance. but both of them have also been influenced by such a spirituality that crosses boundaries. Thank you very much.
Okay, it is time up already. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for everyone. I just want to point out one thing, ma'am, is that one aspect in your paper is that you strongly talk about this connecting between the higher one and the spirituality aspect. But later on, when you talk about the Indian examples, you talk about that interpersonal connections. So if you could just bring that one or highlight that one also, it'll be really nice. We as human beings, and we want to connect with a higher power, and which you define as spirituality. But in the Indian women examples, you talked about how you are spiritual for the husband, for the children, and other things. So you brought out those things. But also another aspect is that when you go ahead and do that, how do you bring in these aspects in the definition with the religions where you don't have the interpersonal God or like personal God, and when you have an impersonal God, how do you relate with them? I mean, for example, Buddhism and others. So these are areas that you can take it. Thank you very much for the